1692, the deadliest and most far-reaching witch hunt in American history ravaged the streets of Salem, Massachusetts.
The Salem witch trials were America's version of a witch holocaust.
Some say that the horror of the witch trials was so profound that its supernatural echoes can still be heard on Salem's streets.
The fact that all those people were killed in innocent blood, that's going to create a hardcore nest of ghosts.
Does one of the accused still cling to her property to this day?
When I saw her standing there, I definitely was startled. I immediately ran back down the stairs.
Was a major disaster the terrifying reality of a witch's curse?
Before he died, he said, "I curse you and Salem."
We'll investigate the paranormal legacy of one of America's oldest cities on Mysterious Journeys, The Witches of Salem. Salem, Massachusetts is a city with two sides. One is a serene historic harbor filled with quaint shops and tree-lined streets. But the other is a somber and sordid place where the specters of the 1692 witch trials still loom. Here, hundreds were executed or jailed, all in the name of witchcraft.
The Salem witch trials were America's version of a witch holocaust. It's certainly the worst case of witchcraft persecution and executions that took place in the history of our nation.
More than 300 years after the trials, the curses of its victims can still be heard whispering through its streets. And the ghosts of the condemned linger among the locals, a chilling legacy of the city's horrific past.
You cannot go to Salem today without being reminded of the witchcraft hysteria everywhere you look.
So how did this quaint maritime village become a brutal, witch-infested world of fear and paranoia? The first seeds of trouble arrived with the Puritans in 1630.
It was a very severe religion. Children were brought up to believe that they were basically sinful. Puritans believed in the doctrine of the elect or predestination. And I think people looked to each other and at each other to make sure that they were all leading the correct life, because if they didn't, God would abandon them.
They'd also brought with them a very real fear of witches.
The early colonists came from England and from Europe, where beliefs and fears about witches were very strong, very fresh. They literally imported those fears and beliefs into the new colonies.
For 60 years, the Puritans struggled to build their community in the New World. But in the fall of 1689, a fiery new minister and his family arrived in Salem, forever changing the village's destiny.
Samuel Parris had not been a minister for his whole adult life. He had been a businessman and then became a minister. Some people thought he was fine. Some people did not. He was kind of a lightning rod, I think.
Then, in 1692, what began as a family dispute in the Parris household spiraled into an hysteria that had dire repercussions for all of Salem.
This is where it all started. This is the ground zero, really, of the Salem witch trials. This was the home of Reverend Samuel Parris, and this is actually the place where the girls used to come and hear their fortunes told by Parris's slave Tituba.
She taught the girls how to divine the future by floating egg whites in a glass of water. And she taught them other kind of witchy little games that were just intended to be fun and entertaining.
Rumors of these secret games spread to several young women in the community.
You had young girls who didn't have any kind of recreation beyond studying scripture, doing their household chores. And here's this really interesting woman named Tituba. Really interesting. Not like anyone else you've ever met. And she has these folkways, things like seeing your future. Well, that must be completely exciting for a teenage girl who has nothing else. So Tituba starts showing them a few things in the kitchen. Samuel Parris walks in and is furious.
And what do I find here? Come on.
So the girls are frantic that they're going to be beat next. So what do? They go into hysterics.
They start barking like dogs, rolling on the floor, thrashing around, actually at one point throwing themselves into the fireplace and having to be physically dragged out of it. And of course their parents are horrified. You know, what's going on with their children?
Abby! I'll fetch Dr. Griggs.
Dr. William Griggs was called in by Samuel Parris to say, look at my children, what's going on here? He said, well, gee, I can't explain it with medicine. There are fits. Something's clearly agitating the child. It has to be witchcraft. She must be bewitched.
They're bewitched.
And immediately the question becomes, if these two children are bewitched and they're victims, who is the person who's bewitched them?
Reverend Parris presumably really believed that his own daughter and niece were victims of evil magic being projected against them. And parents who think their children are under attack aren't always thinking clearly.
Not wanting to get in trouble, the girls shifted blame entirely onto Tituba.
Who is it that bewitches you? Tell me!
It's Tituba.
Believing that a confession would keep her from being jailed or tortured,
Are you a witch?
Tituba's words confirmed the Puritans' deepest fears.
I ask you, are you a witch?
I am a witch!
The town now believed that Satan was in their midst, and their perfect utopia was crumbling. But Tituba went one step further, alleging that 2 other women in the community were witches. She claimed they had all been visited by the devil.
She talked about a tall man with a book who came to her and she had to sign the book. It was believed that you made a pact with the devil and he would take your soul, but in return for that, you had powers.
In the nearby Danvers Archival Center, a chilling record of that fateful day still remains.
Well, this is our vault area, and we have many rare books here, as well as some very interesting manuscripts. One of the nicest items here, which is the Minister's Record Book, and this dates from 1689. And early on, it's in the handwriting of Reverend Samuel Parris, who has a very clear hand. And on March 27th, 1692, he says down here, by these means the devil hath been raised amongst us, and his rage is terrible and vehement, and when he shall be silenced, the Lord only knows.
Reverend Parris was all very much part of it. We've got to find the culprits and root them out, destroy them, get them out of our community.
The attention showered on the girls inspired them to name other members of the community.
The entire hysteria in Salem may not have gone very far if the girls had named really prominent people first. But they named people who were already kind of suspect by a lot of people. So yes, it was easy to say, oh, of course, those people are indeed guilty of witchcraft.
The witch hysteria snowballed as other young women began showing signs of bewitchment and naming other members in the community as witches.
This was a perfect opportunity to accuse your neighbor. You could think back, as many people did, to something that had happened 2 or 3 years ago and say, I think that probably had something to do with witchcraft. And so that's how this built up and sort of spun up into a big crisis for a small town.
Ultimately, hundreds were jailed and 20 were put to death, all in the name of God. But what the remaining townspeople didn't realize was that their actions were brewing a deadly cauldron of vendettas. Coming up, the deadly truth behind a local haunting.
There was one bartender who would not even venture upstairs because she was so deathly afraid of Bridget Bishop.
And later, an alleged witch's curse brings disaster to Salem.
The town caught fire and over a third of the town burned.
In 1692, Salem was consumed by a deadly witch hunt that left several dead and hundreds in prison. But the Puritan fear of witches had roots that extended back to 1486, when one of the most notorious books ever written took witch hunting to a deadly new extreme. Known as the Malleus Maleficarum, or the Hammer of Witches, it gave a violent, standardized protocol for the identification, prosecution, and total annihilation of witchcraft.
Reading the Malleus Maleficarum is quite eye-opening to the ignorance and the fervor and the evil intent. To the ignorance and the fervor and the evil intent of humans. It described all these hideous, horrible things that you were to look for to find a witch.
The book was also a deadly condemnation of women. As the weaker sex, a woman was supposedly more susceptible to the devil's lust and persuasion.
A patriarchal religion rules over women, saying that women are not as powerful or as stable as men, therefore giving them fits of hysteria, frivolous ideas, or they were sexually loose. Then women were persecuted as witches.
It didn't take long for this persecution to spread to the American colonies. And the first woman convicted of witchcraft during the Salem trials was a hot-tempered siren named Bridget Bishop.
She was the town tart. She dressed very flashily. She liked to wear red clothing that was a little too exposed for conservative townsfolk.
Bridget was also the alleged owner of a notorious tavern.
She held parties at her house where she served alcohol and people gambled. So naturally people would be easily swayed that she was one of the witches.
She was a dominant woman, and that was not welcome in puritanical Salem. So what do? You say, well, something must be wrong with you. You must be a witch.
According to historic documents, Bridget was no stranger to the court.
Her reputation preceded her. She had been in court for stealing breasts. She had been in trouble multiple times for getting into violent fights with her husband, Thomas Oliver, her second husband.
But during her arrest in 1692...
Bishop's been cried upon for witchcraft, so she's under house.
Bridget Bishop, we have a warrant for your arrest.
Some eyewitness accounts claim that actual poltergeist activity truly surrounded Bridget.
I have done nothing. Release me!
We shall see that wife in court.
Release me!
Several men who had had the hots for her testified that she came to them in their dreams and that this was proof she was a witch.
Does the defendant wish to respond to the testimony of Goodman Lauder?
I don't even know this man.
Known as spectral evidence, this kind of testimony is now regarded as hearsay.
She's lying, Colonel.
But at the time, it was one of the driving forces behind the witch paranoia.
I will be acquitted today as I...
Today, Bridget's trial is recreated each week in Salem by a theater company called History Alive. But while the performance gives the audience the chance to be the judge, the real Judge Hathorne was not so forgiving.
We, the citizens and magistrates of our Lord and Lady, the King and Queen.
On June 10th, 1692, Bridget became the first hanging victim of the Salem witch hysteria.
Evidence to hold Bridget Bishop for trial.
Stand on Gallows Hill by yourself at dusk and just imagine Bridget Bishop walking up that solitary trail by herself with the sheriff behind her, knowing that in a few moments she was going to hang from a tree. Imagine standing there in absolute terror and confusion that they were going to die for something they didn't do. That has got to be one of the most poignant things about the town.
But some people believe that Bridget's fiery spirit has come back to settle the score at this local haunt.
The Lyceum Bar and Grill is absolutely haunted. There's no question in my mind because I've seen it.
People say they've seen the apparition of Bridget Bishop in the last window looking out.
Some believe it's because the Lyceum sits on sacred ground.
The Lyceum is actually the site of where Bridget Bishop had her apple orchard.
Which is why I think that she doesn't want to leave the building and she's still hanging around. I would say that she just is marking her territory and she wants people to know that she's still here.
During business hours, the Lyceum is a nice restaurant and stylish bar. But after hours, it becomes a place of terror.
At night, it can tend to get a little bit spooky. One time, I was sleeping in the upper loft, and I heard all these glasses breaking downstairs. And when I came down, it was just a massive pile of shattered glass on the floor, and there was nobody else here but me. There was no earthquake involved, so I don't know how these glasses, they just came off the rack by themselves.
Teresa Colbert has been a waitress and bartender at the Lyceum Bar and Grill for 12 years. During that time, she's reportedly experienced numerous paranormal events, including a full-blown apparition of Bridget Bishop.
When I saw her standing there, I definitely was startled. I immediately ran back down the stairs. She has turned lights on actually to help me in the kitchen when I couldn't find a light switch. She has turned all the lights on as I was leaving the restaurant and closing it, and then by the time the staff came in the morning, the lights were off.
Is this another case of hearsay? Or is this truly Bridget's specter reaching out from beyond the grave?
There was one bartender who used to work here who would not even venture upstairs because she was so deathly afraid of Bridget Bishop and that she would get her.
Even in death, the alleged witch seems to be the mistress of her domain.
There was an instance when a bunch of us went downstairs after we set up for a function, and we came back upstairs and everything was rearranged. The tables weren't set right the way we set them, and, you know, it was just really, really strange.
Coming up, an investigator comes face to face with the paranormal.
I see a tall, hooded, robed figure, at least 6 feet tall or higher.
And later, does a brooding house's dark secrets stem from a witch's curse?
I spoke with former tour guides there who said we have seen and heard things around the house, but we're really not supposed to talk about it.
By the time the Salem witch trials came to a close, more than 150 people had been incarcerated, and 19 were hanged. The majority of those tried were women.
Are you a witch?
But there was one 80-year-old man whose story haunts Salem to this day.
They officially say in Salem that no one was ever tortured, but that is not true. When you read the actual records, there were many people tortured either to get testimony or to confess. Probably the most well-known is that of Giles Corey.
Stubborn and outspoken, Giles Corey was critical of the hysteria. It didn't take long for the afflicted girls to point a deadly finger his way.
The most likely people to be named would have been individuals who, for example, might not have attended church as often as they should have, or people who had unpopular positions in town politics.
Giles was also a prosperous farmer, which made him an equally enticing target. Standard practice was, if a person was found guilty, their property could be confiscated by the village.
Sheriff George Corwin, the son of Magistrate John Corwin, after you were convicted, after they found you guilty, he was the one that took your land and divided it up. I mean, talk about a conflict of interest, but that's how it was back then.
Giles Corey, you stand here accused of witchcraft. How plead you?
Giles was sure he'd be convicted, so he came up with a cunning way to keep his inheritance safe from the hands of the sheriff.
Giles Corey stood mute because he refused to enter a plea and was willing to die for it, just to keep his land and his family.
How plead you?
With no plea, English law dictated that Giles couldn't stand trial, so he could never be found guilty.
Sheriff Corwin, take Goodman Corey away.
But Giles also knew that he would probably be either tortured or killed for standing mute. On September 17, 1692, the sheriff led Giles to a patch of open land near the jail.
Sheriff George Corwin set a plank of boards across Giles Corey's chest, and one by one they placed heavy rocks on him, asking for him, give us your plea, demanding it of him.
How do you plead?
But Giles Corey wouldn't give Corwin the answer he wanted.
More weight. More rocks.
Corey, in his typical stubborn New England attitude, he'd say, more weight. I'd ask another question and he'd say, more weight. And he kept this up for hours. This is not an easy death. This takes like 36, 40 hours. It's hugely painful.
How do you plead? More weight. More rocks.
For nearly 2 days, Giles refused to give in.
This is your final chance. How do you plead? More weight. More rocks.
But with his last breath, Giles got the final word, declaring, I curse you and Salem. Giles's curse was potent. Within 4 years of his death, the young Sheriff Corwin dropped dead of a heart condition, an uncanny legacy that allegedly haunts the sheriff's office to this day.
It is said that there has never been a sheriff of Essex County who has not either died of a heart ailment or had to leave office because of a sudden heart ailment.
But far more chilling are reports of Giles's angry ghost lurking around one of Salem's oldest graveyards.
We are standing in the Howard Street Cemetery from 1801, but in the witchcraft hysteria days of 1692, this was a field. This allegedly was where Giles Corey was crushed to death as a witch.
Many believe that Giles's ghost is a bad omen, appearing only before a major disaster strikes Salem.
In the early 1900s, the town caught fire, and for about a week before Giles was seen out near the Howard Street burying ground, the town caught fire and over a third of the town burned. Interestingly enough, the fire stopped at the foot of Gallows Hill, where Corey's wife was hung, along with everybody else.
The spot where the victims were hung is still a subject of debate. But through extensive research, paranormal investigator Molly Stewart believes she's pinpointed the exact location.
This is the closest we can come to where the hangings took place. Now, of course, the hanging tree is not here. It would have been behind me. When they cut the victims down from the ropes, they rolled and tumbled to the bottom of the ravine, and that was their final resting place.
Some reports suggest that the victims' spirits still linger at Gallows Hill.
The fact that all those people, were killed in innocent blood, that's going to create a hardcore nest of ghosts.
One fateful night, Molly walked right into that nest, coming face to face with a chilling spirit.
It was under a full moon. It was kind of late at night. That's when I like to go when no one else is around. And I heard voices at the very top of the hill. I thought, because it's a full moon, maybe these are some local witches doing some kind of ritual. But as I was coming up the hill and taking pictures, there was complete silence by the time I actually got to the top of the hill. And I'm looking around, and I see a tall, hooded, robed figure off to my left, at least 6 feet tall or higher. And this figure didn't move, didn't speak to me, just stood there. And I said, hello? Thought he was being rude. And I came closer, and the figure just vanished right in front of me. So I immediately took a picture. And there's 3 orbs bursting out of the spot where the figure was just the second before. My hair stood straight up, I got a bad vibe, and I left.
Did Molly confront one of Salem's unsettled spirits? For many, the encounter only confirms that Salem's witches won't rest until they're properly buried. Coming up, a famous writer's hidden family legacy.
He was not born Nathaniel Hawthorne. He was born Nathaniel Hathorne, without the W.
And later, a signed confession's startling revelation.
It's basically a confession of forgiveness, in which she says she was used as an instrument by the devil to accuse people that were innocent.
With their dying breath, many of Salem's persecuted leveled deadly threats, promising paranormal justice to their perpetrators. But perhaps no curse was more potent than that of local beggar woman Sarah Good.
She smokes a pipe and she doesn't go to church and she's poor.
Sarah Good was far from the Puritan ideal of a woman. So when she was accused, everyone believed she was guilty.
I do suffer, for there be some amongst us who send out evil spirits against me and others. I call out Sarah Good.
I am not a witch.
The trials were a travesty. First of all, there wasn't a single person involved in the trials who had any legal training, from the judges on down.
Not only did her estranged husband bear witness against her, the court frightened her daughter into testifying for the prosecution. What's more, she was forced to appear in front of the notorious hanging judge, John Hathorne.
John Hathorne was a very enthusiastic witch hunter. He appeared to believe that there was a conspiracy of Satan and he was going to stop it.
Hathorne showed no mercy. He sentenced Sarah to death, despite the fact that she was pregnant. For 7 months, Sarah languished in squalid jail conditions, waiting to give birth.
There were no bedding. It was literally a dungeons, cold, damp, dank.
In those conditions, the newborn died within days.
She had no food to eat. She had very little clean water. There was no way to tend this baby, and they didn't even remove the baby from the jail. It was possibly the spawn of Satan, so we wouldn't want to do that.
Sarah's other child, Dorcas, didn't fare much better. Soon after her mother's sentence, Dorcas became the youngest person to be accused of witchcraft in Salem.
The witch trials went so far, it just defied logic. They arrested a 5-year-old little girl and put her in the dungeons with everybody else.
What could she possibly know? But the girls claimed that her mother, Sarah, taught her how to be a witch.
With Sarah's life destroyed, her children gone, she showed no signs of remorse on the gallows. But before she died, she let the world know her wrath.
Reverend Noyes asked her on the gallows one last time if she would confess to being a witch. And she said, "I am no more a witch than you are a wizard. If I am executed,
God will give you blood to drink."
God will give you blood to drink. The paraphrase of passage in Revelations about people who persecute the innocent.
After Sarah's execution, many forgot about the curse. But 25 years later, Sarah got her bloody revenge on Reverend Noyes.
he probably had an aneurysm. It burst and just flooded the throat and lungs with blood. And yeah, you would choke to death on your own blood. So God will give you blood to drink? He did.
Over a century later, the curse would torment one of the most famous descendants of the Salem witch trials, 19th century author Nathaniel Hawthorne, notorious for his dark, Gothic stories about the underbelly of Puritan beliefs.
Nathaniel Hawthorne was especially interested in Sarah Good's curse, God will give you blood to drink.
Born in Salem, Hawthorne's family ties to the witch hysteria and the Sarah Good curse ran deep.
He was not born Nathaniel Hawthorne. He was born Nathaniel Hathorne without the W, and he was the great-great-grandson of Judge John Hathorne, who sent so many to the gallows at Salem.
The same Judge Hathorne who sentenced Sarah Good to death. Nathaniel Hawthorne was mortified by his association with the hanging judge, ultimately transforming his horror into a novel that exposed the hypocrisy and injustice of the witch trials. Hawthorne's novel, The House of the Seven Gables, was a chilling reworking of Sarah Good's curse.
I think that Nathaniel Hawthorne in some way was trying to expiate the curse that he felt had fallen on his own family. By writing about it in this novel, he was trying to set right a wrong.
The setting of the novel itself was inspired by a discovery the author made in the Hawthorne family home. In the 19th century, the house's original structure was hidden by major renovations.
It looked very different. There were only 3 gables. There were Italianate decorations on it and some Gothic trim.
It was on a visit to the attic that Hawthorne made an intriguing observation.
Supposedly, Nathaniel Hawthorne had come to visit and gone up to the attic and seen these scars of where the original Seven Gables were, and mentioned that, well, the House of Seven Gables, that sounds well.
The house's mysterious aura provided a perfect setting for a 19th century horror novel.
Many people who visit the House of Seven Gables feel a general sense of foreboding. They can't quite put their finger on it, what's there and why, but they walk in and they feel an oppressive atmosphere or an icy feel to the house.
More than 100,000 visitors cross the house's threshold each year, and many report strange encounters.
One witness was up on the highest floor and saw a chair rocking by itself. It was behind the rope, you couldn't get to it. I spoke with former tour guides there who said, you know, yes, we have seen and heard things around the house, but we're really not supposed to talk about it.
Could the House of the Seven Gables be truly cursed, even generations later? And what other unspoken secrets still lurk in the heart of Salem? Coming up, could voodoo be the key to witchcraft hysteria?
If anyone brought a witch into the Salem mix, it was Reverend Samuel Parris with his slave, Tituba.
And later, the missing remains of one of Salem's most unlikely victims.
It was illegal to bring home the body of a condemned witch. Our best guess is that Rebecca's son and her husband went back by nightfall.
By autumn of 1692, Salem had descended into chaos. Growing doubts over the conviction of some of Salem's most upstanding citizens inspired a petition to the governor to stop the witch trials. By the end of the year, the use of spectral evidence had been outlawed. The brutal executions had come to an end, but the horror of the trials still echoed through Salem.
Almost immediately, when the hysteria subsided, there were many people who felt guilty, remorseful, and regretful.
Since then, experts have tried to pinpoint exactly what triggered the hysteria. Many believe it was a widespread fear of anyone who didn't fit the Puritan mold.
The definition of a witch is a real moving target. The most simplest one I can think of is a witch is anyone outside the mainstream who practices a non-mainstream belief system.
The most obvious outsider was Tituba.
If anyone brought a witch into the Salem mix, it was Reverend Samuel Parris with his slave, Tituba.
Sometimes called the Black Witch of
Tituba.
Sometimes called the Black Witch of Salem, Tituba's true origins are unknown. Some claim she came from Barbados, others from Africa.
Tituba was practicing folk magic, things like divination and fortune-telling and folk healing and remedies and all these things that certainly would have looked like witchcraft to a Puritan.
And what do I find here?
Some have even suggested that Tituba practiced a form of voodoo.
Since 1510, when the slave trade began, they took the religion of voodoo wherever they exported slaves. And no matter how much Christians tried to shove Christianity down their throats, they always had their voodoo fetishes and idols to pray to.
But perhaps most intriguing is that the divining method of reading egg whites in water that allegedly sparked the hysteria is reportedly neither African nor Caribbean.
What do you see? Was she a witch or was she just doing games with the kids?
Some historians have looked for scientific reasons to explain the girl's affliction.
Another theory was the ergot poisoning theory, which is the naturally reoccurring fungus on rye, which was a grain that they grew. It looks like it's a withered grain, so it wouldn't look like there was something wrong. It just looks like there's a dried up seed in it. Ergot would have produced convulsions in people eating infected bread.
From trances to violent thrashing, many of the symptoms displayed by the Salem girls shared eerie similarities to other documented cases of ergot poisoning.
There was an episode of ergot poisoning in France after World War II when the rye crop was infected and people did have convulsions.
But some of the symptoms don't match up.
Ergot poisoning produces convulsions in people with a vitamin A deficiency. Given the food available in Salem in 1692, they probably did not have a vitamin A deficiency. If a person does not have a vitamin A deficiency, the symptom is gangrene, not convulsions, and nobody reported gangrene.
The most generally accepted theory is that the girls became consumed by the attention showered on them.
Everybody, from the sheriff on down, was hanging on their every word. They had more power than they would ever again have in their lives.
Bridget Bishop, we have a warrant for your arrest.
It literally became a juggernaut. In fact, it started extending way beyond Salem.
Release me!
At that point, there were so many people who were believing the girls as legitimate arbiters of good and evil that adults were willing to go along with almost anything they said.
Is it possible that a few young women knowingly sent nearly 24 people to their death? Only one accuser would ever formally apologize for her actions.
Once Paris was basically thrown out of the congregation after the witchcraft was over, a new minister, Reverend Joseph Green, came, and he tried to bring back some peace to the village. And one of the things he did was, when Ann Putnam, the 12-year-old chief accuser in 1692, wanted to become a full-fledged church member in the early 1700s, Green asked if she would do this confession, in which she says she's sorry that in her youth she was used as an instrument by the devil to accuse people that she now believed were innocent. And the neat thing about it is right here is the signature. We don't think Anne could read or write, but she could write her name. And there's her name acknowledging this.
Was it adolescent mind games, witchcraft, political manipulation, or did some other combination of elements escalate into one of the most diabolical moments of American history? Coming up, a community struggle to forget its deadly past.
When I was a kid in Danvers, in polite society, you didn't talk about the witchcraft.
300 years ago, witches were persecuted and hanged in Salem. Today, witches flock here, making up more than 5% of the local population.
Salem is about 48,000 people, and there are 3,000 witches. So we're doing very well.
From the Witch Museum, to the Witch Dungeon, to the Witch House, nearly every corner of Salem reminds you that you are in Witch City.
Along the East Coast, every seaport has a maritime history, but none of these other seaports have witches and magic. Only Salem.